Have you ever wondered why the story of Adam and Eve feels incomplete? What if I told you that according to ancient texts, Eve wasn't actually Adam's first wife? There was another woman created at the exact same time as Adam from the exact same clay, who refused to submit and was cast out of paradise forever. Her name was Lilith, and her story has been deliberately hidden from mainstream religious teachings for thousands of years. Today, we're diving deep into one of history's most controversial and suppressed narratives that challenges everything you thought you knew about the beginning of humanity. The story of Lilith doesn't appear in the Bible that most people know today, but that doesn't mean it isn't ancient or significant. In fact, her origins trace back to some of the oldest mythological texts in human history, predating even the Hebrew scriptures by thousands of years. To understand Lilith, we need to journey back to ancient Mesopotamia, to the cradle of civilization itself, where her earliest incarnations first emerged in the shadows of human consciousness. The earliest references to Lilith-like figures appear in Sumerian mythology, dating back to around 3000 BCE. In these ancient tablets, we encounter demons and spirits associated with the night, with sexuality, and with the dangers that lurked beyond the safety of civilized society. The Sumerians spoke of creatures called the Lilith, nocturnal demons who were said to prey upon men in their sleep and bring harm to pregnant women and newborns. These weren't just random monster stories. They represented deep-seated fears about the untamed feminine, about sexuality without the bonds of marriage and societal control. As civilizations evolved and merged, so did the mythology surrounding these figures. The Babylonians and Assyrians inherited these stories, transforming and expanding them. In the famous Epic of Gilgamesh, one of humanity's oldest literary works, we encounter a figure called the Lilith who inhabits the sacred tree. When the hero Gilgamesh cuts down the tree, this creature flees to the wilderness, establishing a pattern that would echo through centuries of storytelling about Lilith's banishment and her association with wild, untamed places. But the transformation from ancient demon to Adam's first wife is where the story becomes truly fascinating and controversial. This evolution happened gradually through Jewish mystical traditions, reaching its most developed form in medieval texts that sought to explain inconsistencies in the biblical creation story. You see, there's a puzzling detail in the book of Genesis that has troubled scholars for millennia. In Genesis chapter 1, verse 27, the text states that God created mankind in his own image. Male and female, he created them. This suggests simultaneous creation of man and woman as equals. But then, in Genesis chapter 2, we get the famous story of Adam being created first, falling into a deep sleep, and Eve being formed from his rib. This apparent contradiction bothered ancient scholars, and their solution was revolutionary. What if there were two different women? The first woman, created simultaneously with Adam from the same earth, was Lilith. The second woman, created from Adam's rib after Lilith's departure, was Eve. This explanation not only resolved the biblical inconsistency, but opened up an entirely new narrative about human origins, one that challenged fundamental assumptions about gender, power, and the nature of the first humans. According to the medieval text known as the Alphabet of Ben Sira, written sometime between the 8th and 10th centuries CE, Lilith and Adam were created as perfect equals. Both were formed from the same divine clay. Both possessed the same divine spark. Both were equally human and equally deserving of respect and autonomy. This equality, however, quickly became a source of conflict in their relationship. The text describes their first major disagreement occurring during intimate relations. Lilith insisted that she should not always be in the subordinate position, arguing that since they were created equal, they should relate to each other as equals in all aspects of their relationship. Adam, however, demanded that she submit to his authority, claiming superiority simply by virtue of being male. This wasn't just about physical positioning. It was about fundamental questions of power, autonomy, and the nature of relationships between men and women. When Lilith refused to submit, Adam appealed to God for support. But rather than forcing Lilith to comply, God sent 3 angels to negotiate with her. The angels found Lilith by the Red Sea, a location that's significant in Jewish mysticism as a place of transformation and crossing between worlds. They offered her a choice: return to Adam and accept a subordinate role, or face the consequences of her rebellion. Lilith's response was defiant and tragic. logic. She chose freedom over security, autonomy over comfort. She accepted banishment from Eden rather than surrender her equality. The angels warned her that as punishment, she would lose 100 of her demon children every day. Lilith accepted even this terrible price, but she also made her own vow. She would have her revenge against Adam's lineage, particularly targeting newborn children and women in childbirth. This part of the story reveals something profound about ancient anxieties surrounding childbirth and infant mortality. In times when medical knowledge was limited, when women frequently died in childbirth and infant mortality rates were staggering, people needed explanations for these tragedies. Lilith became the scapegoat, the supernatural explanation for the very real dangers that plagued human reproduction. But Lilith's story doesn't end with her banishment. According to various mystical traditions, she became the queen of demons, ruling over a realm of supernatural beings who existed parallel to the human world. She was said to be incredibly beautiful, seductive, and dangerous, capable of appearing to men in their dreams and leading them astray. She represented everything that patriarchal society feared about unconstrained feminine power: sexuality without reproduction, beauty without submission, power without male approval. The symbolism surrounding Lilith is rich and complex. She is associated with the night, representing the mysterious and unknown aspects of existence that daylight rational thought cannot penetrate. She is connected to the moon, particularly the dark moon phase, symbolizing hidden feminine wisdom and the cyclical nature of feminine power. Her association with owls and other nocturnal creatures links her to wisdom that comes through darkness and intuition rather than conventional learning. In some traditions, Lilith is described as having wings, representing her ability to transcend earthly limitations and move freely between worlds. Her long, flowing hair is said to be her source of power, connecting her to ancient beliefs about hair as a repository of spiritual energy. Her feet are sometimes described as being like those of birds of prey, suggesting her predatory nature and her ability to strike swiftly and decisively. The story of Lilith's relationship with sexuality is particularly complex and controversial. Unlike Eve, who was created to be Adam's helper and companion, Lilith was created as his equal partner. This meant that her sexuality was not primarily oriented toward reproduction and nurturing, but toward pleasure, power, and self-expression. This kind of autonomous female sexuality was deeply threatening in patriarchal societies because it existed outside male control and served female rather than male interests. As centuries passed, different cultures added their own layers to the Lilith mythology. In Kabbalistic traditions, she became associated with the left side of the tree of life, representing the harsh, judgmental aspects of divine energy. Some mystical texts describe her as Adam's wife in spiritual realms, even after their earthly separation, suggesting that their relationship represented fundamental cosmic principles that transcended their personal conflict. Medieval Christian traditions were generally hostile to Lilith, seeing her as a demon pure and simple. However, some Gnostic texts presented a more nuanced view, sometimes portraying her as a figure of wisdom who refused to accept false limitations. These texts often emphasized the spiritual significance of her rebellion, suggesting that her refusal to submit represented the soul's refusal to accept spiritual slavery. Islamic traditions also incorporated elements of the Lilith story, though often in different forms. Some Islamic texts describe supernatural beings called jinn who share characteristics with Lilith, including the ability to seduce humans and exist in parallel realms. The Queen of Sheba, who appears in Islamic tradition, sometimes takes on Lilith-like characteristics, being described as powerful, autonomous, and slightly supernatural. The Renaissance period saw renewed interest in Lilith, particularly among scholars studying ancient texts and occult traditions. Artists began depicting her in paintings and sculptures, often emphasizing her beauty and her tragic nature. She became a symbol of the price of defying social conventions, but also of the dignity that comes from refusing to compromise one's essential nature. During the Romantic period of the 18th and 19th centuries, Lilith experienced a significant transformation in how she was perceived and portrayed. Romantic poets and artists, who were themselves often rebels against social conventions, saw in Lilith a kindred spirit. She became a symbol of the noble rebel, the one who chooses chooses authentic existence over comfortable conformity. The feminist movements of the 19th and 20th centuries embraced Lilith as an early symbol of women's liberation. She represented the woman who refused to accept society's limitations, who demanded equality in relationships, and who was willing to pay the price for her autonomy. Feminist scholars began re-examining her story not as a cautionary tale about the dangers of female rebellion, but as an inspiring example of a woman who knew her worth and refused to settle for less. Modern psychological interpretations of the Lilith story see her as representing the shadow side of the feminine psyche, the aspects of female nature that patriarchal society has tried to suppress. Carl Jung and other depth psychologists suggested that Lilith represents the anima's dark aspects, the feminine principles that exist within all humans, but are often rejected or feared. Contemporary neo-pagan and goddess spirituality movements have reclaimed Lilith as a positive figure, a goddess of female empowerment and sexual autonomy. In these traditions, her story is seen as describing the systematic suppression of goddess-centered religions by patriarchal monotheisms. Her banishment from Eden represents the historical transition from societies that honored feminine divinity to those that subordinated it. The ecological movement has also found meaning in Lilith's story, seeing her association with wild places and untamed nature as relevant to current environmental crises. She represents the natural world that refuses to be completely controlled or domesticated, the wilderness that exists beyond human manipulation and demands respect on its own terms. In popular culture, Lilith has appeared in countless books, movies, television shows, and video games. She's been portrayed as everything from a terrifying demon to a misunderstood victim to a powerful goddess. Each portrayal reflects the values and concerns of its particular time and audience, showing how mythological figures continue to evolve and remain relevant across centuries. The academic study of Lilith reveals fascinating insights into how mythologies develop and change over time. Scholars trace her evolution from ancient Mesopotamian demon to medieval Jewish mystical figure to modern feminist icon, showing how each culture adapts mythological material to address its own concerns and anxieties. What makes Lilith's story particularly compelling is how it addresses questions that remain relevant today. Issues of gender equality, sexual autonomy, the balance between individual freedom and social harmony, and the price of refusing to conform are as pertinent now as they were thousands of years ago. Her story forces us to confront uncomfortable questions about power, relationships, and the costs of standing up for our principles. Some scholars argue that the Lilith story represents humanity's oldest recorded account of divorce, describing what happens when two people discover they have fundamentally incompatible views about the nature of their relationship. Others see it as a creation myth that acknowledges the reality of gender conflict while exploring possible origins for these tensions. The story also raises profound questions about the nature of paradise itself. If Eden was truly perfect, why couldn't it accommodate Lilith's desire for equality? Her banishment suggests that the paradise described in Genesis was actually a patriarchal utopia, perfect only for those willing to accept traditional gender hierarchies. Her exile reveals the limitations and exclusions built into seemingly universal ideals. Modern retellings of the Lilith story often focus on her experience after leaving Eden. What was it like to be the first woman to choose freedom over security? How did she survive in the wilderness? What did she learn from her experiences that Eve, protected in the garden, never discovered? These questions inspire contemporary writers and artists to imagine Lilith's untold story. The psychological dimension of choosing autonomy over belonging resonates deeply with modern audiences. Many people, particularly women, recognize the dilemma Lilith faced: conform to others' expectations and maintain relationships and security, or maintain personal integrity and face isolation and conflict. Her choice to prioritize authenticity over acceptance speaks to fundamental questions about how to live with integrity in a world that often demands compromise. Religious scholars continue to debate Lilith's significance and the accuracy of various traditions surrounding her. Some argue that medieval Jewish mystical texts should not be taken as historical accounts, but rather as theological explorations of gender and power. Others contend that these stories preserve ancient oral traditions that provide valuable insights into early human spiritual development. The question of whether Lilith should be feared or celebrated remains contentious. Traditional interpretations emphasize her dangerous aspects, her role as a threat to families and children. Progressive interpretations focus on her courage and her refusal to accept injustice. Both perspectives acknowledge her power, but they evaluate that power very differently. As we conclude this exploration of Lilith's origins and evolution, we're left with more questions than answers. Was she a real figure whose story was gradually mythologized, or was she always a symbolic representation of psychological and social forces? Does her story describe historical events, or does it function as a teaching tool designed to explore complex human issues? What seems certain is that Lilith's story continues to resonate because it addresses fundamental human experiences and dilemmas. Her tale speaks to anyone who has ever faced the choice between authentic self-expression and social acceptance, between personal integrity and comfortable conformity. Whether we see her as humanity's first feminist, as a cautionary tale about the dangers of pride, or as a complex mythological figure representing multiple aspects of human nature, Lilith remains one of history's most compelling and controversial characters. Her legacy challenges us to examine our own assumptions about gender, power, relationships, and the price of freedom. In a world still grappling with issues of equality and autonomy, Lilith's ancient story remains surprisingly modern, reminding us that some human struggles transcend time and culture, connecting us across millennia to our most fundamental questions about how to live authentic, meaningful lives.